Hi guys, I thought I could make some sort of making of behind the scene of how to make those Flashback Universe comics. I'm not going to cover everything. Essentially, I'm just going to cover just a few things. But if you want a more in-depth, in-detail analysis of how to make actually comics, just ask and I'll see what I can do. Usually Jim would send me a script and I would make rough drawings like this one to get started. But in this case, I actually proposed this story to Jim. So essentially I drew about half a dozen or two pages, pretty much rough like this one, just to try to sell the idea to Jim. Once Jim was hooked on the idea, then I proceeded to actually do the actual artwork. Essentially, this artwork was done on multiple layers. I did like one layer for Ornamu and the front, another layer for the characters in the middle ground, another layers for the characters in the background, and the background itself is another layer all by itself. Then Jim took the artwork and did a rough attempt at trying to put in the type. I essentially tried to keep all the type that I had in my rough, and also he also kept the heads on the side, which is some sort of roll call to try to introduce all the characters at once. It's something that was used quite a lot by the Justice League comics in the 70s, and even the Avengers comics at the time. The headshots from the characters were taken from previous artwork that I had done in the past. But this is actually what Jim ended up going with. He got rid of all the roll calls, he got rid of all the text at the top, and essentially it allowed us to have essentially the action scene bigger and to have more impact on the page. Again, you can see some of the rough artwork that I did to pitch the idea to Jim, and also I have some dialogues, but those dialogues are just placeholders. Although sometimes Jim would keep some of the dialogues I already originally had, but usually he would get rid of them and actually write some actual dialogues. And this is the actual artwork that I would send Jim. You can compare it with the rough that you saw just a bit before. Essentially, I stayed pretty close to the rough in this case. Again, you can see very rough artwork, just with enough indication so that Jim would know what the intent was. And again, you can see that Jim added a lot of dialogue in this case. And also, there's one of the panels that I literally flopped and that I tweet quite a bit. And you can see here essentially the final artwork that I shipped to Jim. And again, here you can see some rough artwork with some very rough dialogue. When you compare it with the actual finished page, it's night and day. Jim did a great job taking my very rough idea and building on top of that. And you can see some of the artwork that I used as placeholders in the quote-unquote folders. And here I did a second pass on the rough to try to come up with the artwork that I would use, the actual artwork that I would use. And here you can see Jim suggested that we could reuse essentially some artwork from the Paladin comic. There was a piece of artwork that would have been perfect for this sequence, so that's what I ended up using. So I used the artwork from the Paladin comic, as you can see, but in the artwork itself, I added two characters that weren't there before. Essentially, it's the Saturn King, and it's the character Red Death, who would have appeared in a future comic that we were planning to do. Sadly, in the end, we ended up never doing that comic. And here, essentially, you can see some of the rough artwork that I used. Essentially, I would do the artwork on separate pieces of paper, and I would scan the whole thing and then I would tweak it with Photoshop to try to give the illusion that it was actual inked drawing. Ideally, comics should be like done in pencil, then inked over the pencil, and then colored over all of that. Sadly, since I was pretty much doing all the artwork myself, it was too time consuming. I had to try to find some shortcuts in some ways to try to save at least a bit of time. Otherwise, it would have taken me two years to make each comics. So essentially, I would straight from the penciled artwork with Photoshop, I would tweak the artwork to kind of look as if it was inked. It wasn't as smooth as if it had actually been inked, but the line was dark enough that it worked well enough. And with the bold coloring that I would add on top of that, it was kind of working. Here we have another example of like two panels that were done separately. And essentially, I take all those elements and I put them all together using Photoshop, and then I added the background behind the characters. And here's the background that I ended up using in many shots. Essentially, the very first panel, I'm sure you recognize some of the artwork. And essentially, in various other panels, I would reuse bits and pieces of this actual background. So it did save me a bit of work, but not as much as you might think. And somehow I would have the crazy madness that many artists had. Essentially, I did a first version of Our Friend Hitler, which was fine, but for some reason I ended up not liking it, and I made a second version that I ended up using instead. And here is essentially a montage of the various looks of Longinus that I put together in order to be able to show to Jim and to get his approval whether he actually liked this or not. And that's what I ended up using in the sequence where you see Longinus in his study, even though in the end we ended up not using the page after all. So again, here you can see the artwork with none of the lettering. And you can see the background. It's the background that I showed you a bit earlier. So essentially, all those panels were done separately on separate pieces of paper, and I would put them all together using our friend Photoshop. And again, you may notice like the background in pretty much all those panels is the background that I showed you a bit earlier. And here you can see in the various computer screens, you can see various artwork that I had done before for various reasons. Like in some cases, it was just a model sheet I did to show Jim for approval. So here we have this page again, and the World War II panel with all the characters, it's essentially a piece of artwork that I did separately, and again with Photoshop I added it to the rest of the artwork. Nowadays I don't use Photoshop quite as much. Instead I use another program that's called Sketchbook Pro that gives a much better result. And essentially to make those videos that I made that you saw essentially, I'm using a program that's called Storyboard Pro. Essentially, Storyboard Pro is made, as the name says, to make storyboards, but it works fine to make short animations or to make videos using old comic books, as you saw. So using Storyboard Pro, I'm essentially able to cut the page apart so that I can isolate each panel individually, and I can create the videos that you've been seeing for a bit. And then using Movie Maker, that's how I can add some sound on top of them comics. So that's pretty much it for this quick making of. If you guys would like to see a more detailed version where I explain more in depth the whole process behind making them comics, just ask and I'll see what I can do about that. So that's pretty much it for now, guys. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.